The arrival of Europeans. How the first English colonies began in America. The history of the United States did not begin with the arrival of Europeans. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean, millions of indigenous people lived across North America. They had their own languages, cultures, governments, traditions, and ways of life. However, beginning in the late 15th century, European exploration changed the history of the continent forever. The story of European America is a story of exploration, ambition, hope, conflict, survival, and tragedy. It began with a journey across a vast and dangerous ocean and eventually led to the creation of colonies that would become part of the United States. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer sailing under the Spanish flag, crossed the Atlantic Ocean. He was searching for a western route to Asia, hoping to find valuable trade opportunities. Instead, he reached islands in the Caribbean. Columbus believed he had reached Asia, but he was actually in a completely different part of the world. His voyages opened the door to further European exploration and colonization of the Americas. After Columbus's voyages, Spain, France, England, and other European powers became interested in the New World. They wanted land, wealth, natural resources, and new trade routes. They also wanted to spread Christianity and increase their political influence. Spanish explorers were among the first Europeans to establish settlements in North America. In 1565, the Spanish founded St. Augustine in present-day Florida. It became the oldest continuously inhabited European established settlement in the continental United States. But England also wanted to establish a permanent presence in North America. In 1585, the English attempted to create a colony on Roanoke Island, located off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The expedition was supported by Sir Walter Raleigh. The colony struggled to survive, and the settlers eventually disappeared. The mysterious disappearance of the Roanoke colonists became one of the greatest mysteries in American history. Years later, England made another attempt. In 1606, King James I granted permission to the Virginia Company to establish an English colony in North America. A group of settlers left England in December of that year. After a difficult journey across the Atlantic, they arrived in Virginia. On May 13, 1607, the settlers established Jamestown. Named in honor of King James I, Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in North America. However, life in Jamestown was extremely difficult. The settlers faced many challenges. They did not have enough food. They struggled with disease. They had limited knowledge of the environment and did not know how to survive in the new land. Many settlers were not farmers. Some expected to find gold and become rich quickly. Instead, they faced hunger and hardship. During the first winter, the situation became especially terrible. Food supplies became dangerously low, and many settlers died. The colony might have disappeared completely if not for help from indigenous people and the leadership of Captain John Smith. John Smith became one of the most important leaders of Jamestown. He encouraged the settlers to work and helped organize the colony. According to his own writings, Smith also had an important encounter with Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan, a powerful indigenous leader. The story of John Smith and Pocahontas later became famous in American culture. However, historians believe that many details of the popular story are different from what actually happened. Relations between the English settlers and indigenous communities were complicated. Sometimes they traded and cooperated. At other times, they fought over land and resources. The English colony continued to struggle, but a major change came with the introduction of tobacco as a profitable crop. John Rolfe, an English settler, helped develop tobacco cultivation in Virginia. Tobacco quickly became an important cash crop. The demand for tobacco grew in Europe, and Virginia's economy began to expand. However, the growth of the tobacco industry had a dark side. The colony increasingly relied on forced labor, including enslaved Africans. In 1619, a group of Africans arrived in Virginia. Their status and legal situation were different from the system of racial slavery that developed later, but their arrival marked an important moment in the history of slavery in English North America. Over the following decades, slavery became deeply connected to the economic and social development of the colonies. While Jamestown was growing in Virginia, another important group of English settlers was preparing to cross the Atlantic. These settlers were known as the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were religious separatists who wanted to practice their faith independently. In 1620, they sailed across the Atlantic aboard a ship called the Mayflower. The journey was difficult. After weeks at sea, the Mayflower reached the coast of North America. The Pilgrims originally planned to settle farther south, but they landed in what is now Massachusetts. Before leaving the ship, a group of male settlers signed an agreement known as the Mayflower Compact. It established a basic form of self-government for the new settlement. The Pilgrims established Plymouth Colony. Their first winter was devastating. Many settlers died because of cold weather, disease, and a lack of food. The surviving colonists received help from indigenous people, including members of the Wampanoag Confederation. One important figure was Tisquantum, commonly known as Squanto. He had learned English and helped the settlers understand local farming techniques and the environment. In 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated a harvest with members of the Wampanoag community. This event is often remembered as the first Thanksgiving. However, the history of Thanksgiving is more complicated than the traditional story often taught in schools. Relations between European settlers and indigenous peoples later became increasingly violent as colonial settlements expanded. The arrival of Europeans brought enormous changes to North America. European settlers introduced new crops, animals, technologies, and political systems. But they also brought diseases that devastated indigenous populations. Diseases such as smallpox caused the deaths of enormous numbers of indigenous people who had no previous exposure to many European illnesses. As European colonies expanded, conflicts over land became more common. The English settlers wanted more farmland and resources. Indigenous nations wanted to protect their homes and territories. These competing interests led to wars and violence. Despite these challenges, English settlements continued to grow. During the 17th century, more and more Europeans crossed the Atlantic and established colonies along the eastern coast of North America. The colonies developed different economies and cultures. In the South, agriculture became extremely important. Large plantations produced tobacco, rice, and later other crops. The economy increasingly depended on enslaved labor. In the North, the economy was more diverse. Colonists relied on farming, fishing, shipbuilding, trade, and small businesses. Over time, 13 English colonies developed along the Atlantic coast. These colonies were not yet the United States. They were separate communities under British rule, but the people living there gradually developed their own identities and traditions. They were thousands of miles away from Britain. They had different experiences from people living in Europe. They created local governments, built towns, developed businesses, and formed new communities. Yet their future would eventually be shaped by a growing question: should these colonies remain under British control, or should they become independent? That question would take more than a century to fully emerge. For now, the English colonies were still young. Jamestown had survived its early struggles. Plymouth had established a new community. Other colonies were beginning to appear. The population of European settlers continued to increase. But the story of colonial America was also a story of indigenous resistance, forced displacement, slavery, and cultural change. The arrival of Europeans created a new chapter in North American history, but it came at a tremendous human cost. The colonies would continue to grow and change throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Eventually, disagreements between the colonies and Great Britain would become impossible to ignore. Taxes, political rights, representation, and freedom would become major issues. And from these conflicts, a revolution would emerge. A revolution that would change the world. But before that revolution could begin, the colonies had to grow. They had to develop their own economies, communities, and political ideas. The story of the United States was still in its early stages. And the next chapter would be even more dramatic. It would begin with growing tension between the American colonies and the British Empire. That tension would eventually lead to one of the most important events in American history: the American Revolution.